This is What's at Stake, a Penta podcast.
Hi, my name's Stratton Kirton. I'm a partner at Penta, and you're listening to What's at Stake, a Penta podcast. On today's show, I'm joined by some of DC's top climate experts and my friends from the Climate Leadership Council, Greg Bertelsen, CLC's CEO, and Catrina Rorke, CLC's Senior Vice President of Policy and Research. Greg and Catrina, welcome to What's at Stake.
Thanks, Stratton. Great to be with you. Good to see you.
So I'll open this up to both of you, but for our listeners who may not be super familiar, can you tell us, just to start, what kind of work does the Climate Leadership Council do?
Sure. So I'll start. Climate Leadership Council is a nonpartisan think tank. We are focused on the most efficient, effective, politically viable climate solutions, and we tend to focus on those that leverage the power of the marketplace. So finding market incentives to allow the free market to do what it does best, which is find efficient solutions. So at a very high level, that's what we're focused on. I'll let Catrina share a little more.
Thanks, Greg. At the council, we also have the Center for Climate and Trade. I serve as its executive director. At the center, we work with researchers, policymakers, important stakeholders in the policy community to look more specifically on how to leverage our trade relationships and the global market economy towards climate solutions and greater international cooperation. So that sits under our council umbrella too.
Okay. So is it fair to say that the Climate Leadership Council has a big focus both on markets and on trade policy versus what people might think of as traditional environmental or climate policy being, energy tax incentives and things like that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We're focused at the system level, if you will, and seeking very high impact points in the marketplace to, through policy, inject incentives to change market behavior towards activities that are lower carbon while limiting the role of government as much as possible.
But, it's interesting that it seems like only a few years ago, trade and climate change were not spoken of together. They were two separate conversations. It seems like that has evolved a lot. So I'd be curious if you could tell us, your experience and why the focus on trade is so important and how those policy conversations as they relate to climate change have evolved in the last few years.
Yeah, it's a great question, Stratton. I have spoken with a lot of my colleagues not in the climate space who say they all work on climate now, and trade is part of that evolution. But there's a few reasons that we're working on trade tools specifically. The first is that trade has loomed over the domestic climate policy discussion since the dawn of time. There's always a concern about whether our international partners are doing their part, whether we're going to put domestic firms at a disadvantage or offshore jobs and economic opportunity. But also, how do we get better, cleaner technologies out into the global marketplace? Mm-hmm. How do we take what the U.S. does really well in terms of efficiencies and industrial processes and export those lessons learned? So these are fundamentally trade questions that sort of sit around the climate policy conversation and always have. The second reason is that trade has huge consequences for environmental ambition. Our research from partner organizations has demonstrated that trade approaches can uniquely address global emissions, which is the true heart of the climate problem. And so we want to ensure that we're using the best tools possible so that the U.S. and our international partners are reducing our emissions apace. Trade tools allow us to unlock a different kind of climate solution set. And there's also growing political momentum, abundant opportunity for new policymaking in this space. We're tilling new soil, and it's pretty exciting to see the kinds of climate policies that we can bring to bear now that we're tapping a new toolkit.
Interesting. I think this is probably a question for you and Greg, but it seems like just in the last couple of years, there have been some major developments that hit squarely to where you're talking about. The European Union's talking about a border carbon adjustment. We obviously had the Inflation Reduction Act and issues of domestic sourcing, and then, issues of figuring out how do we align that with both our geopolitical partners and free trade agreement partners. And then just very recently at the end of last year, the US and the EU announcing, at least a tentative outline on a green steel and aluminum compact. So So I'm curious, one, are those the sorts of policies that you're talking about? And then two, can you illustrate for our listeners, how does CLC engage in those debates to try to make trade policy work for climate policy?
Well, I can start, Stratton, perhaps with that second part of your question. A big focus of ours right now is highlighting the opportunity to policy makers that exists at this climate and trade nexus. And so a few important background points, which Catrina mentioned in her early remarks, which is we've done analysis which shows that the U.S. economy on average is more carbon efficient than most of the rest of the world. Said differently, we can make most things that are consumed around the world while emitting less carbon. So that's a very positive environmental story that we're able to tell as a country, that manufacturers in the United States are able to promote. What we are saying through this suite of policies or through this policy intersection is, why aren't we seeking a way to leverage that carbon advantage, leverage our greater carbon efficiency to the benefit of the global climate, right? To the benefit of lowering global emissions, but also to the benefit of those manufacturers and workers and communities that are operating most efficiently. And so what's so interesting, along with the economic potential, the environmental potential in this suite of policies, is the opportunity to bring together a political coalition like we've never seen before on climate. So if you come to this discussion purely with an interest in lowering global emissions, we're talking about approximately a quarter of global emissions that are captured through global trade. So huge opportunity in reducing global emissions. If you come to this discussion purely with an interest in boosting U.S. economy and supporting U.S. workers, we're about twice as efficient as the global average in most manufacturing processes. And so if we get the incentives, there's a huge opportunity to boost the competitiveness of U.S. firms and, by extension, spurring greater economic development, growth, jobs, and so on. And so those interests and sort of everything in between presents a unique political opportunity, which I think is why you're seeing such a increased interest among policymakers in the U.S. And also, I should note, the EU has a similar environmental record. And for that reason, in part, they too are exploring these types of policy solutions.
Catrina, I want to get to you in a second to dive into this in a report that you guys released late last year. But Greg, could you explain for our listeners just a little more? You said we're seeing sort of a unique political coalition come together. I mean, we're in an environment where everyone just wants to focus on the dysfunction of government and the dysfunction of the House. But so you're telling us that, there's actually a moment in a new coalition of people coming together. Can you just illustrate what you mean by that? So you said people wanting to recognize the investments that American companies have made, and also people recognizing that we can leverage that for greater environmental outcomes. So does that mean bipartisan progress on climate is possible?
I believe it's the most promising arena in climate for bipartisan cooperation that we've ever seen. And there are early indicators to support that belief. So on the Democratic side of the aisle, late last year, Senator Schatz, White House, and Heinrich published an op-ed in Time magazine titled "What's Next for U.S. Climate Policy?" This was in the wake of the Inflation Reduction Act. Mm-hmm. And one of the core pillars of their op-ed was the adoption of a U.S. border carbon adjustment. On the Republican side of the aisle, over the course of the last year, we've already seen members of Congress like Senators Kramer, Senators Cassidy, Senator Graham step out and support these concepts quite publicly. And so if you think about where those senators are located, which states they represent, you've got manufacturing senators, you've got coastal senators, you've got agricultural senators, Republicans and Democrats from a pretty broad spectrum on the political scale, all converging towards this approach. And I think there's two big reasons for that. One is climate. Again, a huge opportunity to take a big bite out of global emissions. But the second is a fundamentally different way to approach climate policy and to approach how we talk about the economics of climate policy. So a lot of discussion over the last 2 decades about climate policy driving green jobs and new technologies. And that's an important message. And that's true. But what's been lost is, what about incumbent workers in industries like steel and aluminum and chemicals manufacturing? When you approach this issue through the climate and trade lens, when you talk about leveraging the efficiency of our manufacturers, you are telling workers in those industries that not only are you a part of the low carbon future, you're part of the solution of the low carbon future. And that's what I believe is fundamentally different about this approach. And that's why we're so optimistic about bipartisan support around it.
No, absolutely. That's a great point, because you said U.S. industries on average are twice as efficient as global ones. And I think when people think about that, they don't think about traditional heavy industries and like the efficiency and the investments that have already been made here in the U.S. If I can pivot just for a second, Catrina, Greg had mentioned earlier that I think he said a quarter of all global emissions aren't currently sort of covered in climate negotiations or represented by trade. Now, you guys released a report that you were one of the authors of late last year, right? I think it was on carbon loopholes. Can you just tell us a little bit about that and help further illustrate that point?
You bet, Stratton. Thanks. So the carbon loophole is a term that describes this phenomenon where emissions are related to the production of goods and services wherever they're produced in the world. And about 25% of global emissions are associated with the production of goods and services in one country for the consumption of those goods and services in another. These emissions are the carbon loophole. It's about 25%. It's been about 25% for the last 25 to 30 years. As global emissions are growing, so is the loophole. And traditional climate accounting is not allowing us to capture these emissions because it tends to focus only on what countries do domestically. So when we tabulate U.S. emissions, we care about what domestic production looks like. We don't consider traded emissions conventionally in climate accounting. So this is a shortcoming in the way that we set decarbonization goals, in the way that we talk about emissions reductions here in the U.S., but also in other climate ambitious nations. And so what we're trying to do here is study the problem so that we can develop the tools to address it. What we've found is that the carbon loophole is in part the result of imperfect incentives that push climate ambitious countries to offshore carbon intensive manufacturing. That manufacturing tends to shift from efficient countries like the US and into less advanced, less climate-focused countries where emissions to create the very same dollar of value can be dramatically higher. And so the net climate impact is actually higher global emissions as a result of the carbon loophole. We also find that the vast majority of carbon flows are moving from these more sort of advanced climate-focused nations into the developing world, which is naturally moving slower on their decarbonization targets. And so we don't have a policy toolkit to address those emissions today. That's what we can access with trade policies. That's why studying the carbon loophole is so important.
So what are the tools or the policies that we need to address the carbon loophole? I mean, as you said, 25% is a huge number. I assume that's bigger than any single country emitter, or is that bigger than the U.S.?
It's bigger than the U.S., yeah.
Okay.
We mentioned some of the tools already. So we've got these negotiations underway with the European Union to address the carbon intensity of traded steel and aluminum, the Global Arrangement for Sustainable Steel and Aluminum. That's one of the tools in the toolkit that we can use here. The European Union is developing a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a mouthful of a policy name, to sit next to its domestic emissions mitigation strategy in order to address imported emissions to the European Union. We've also seen members of Congress put forward border carbon adjustment type solutions that allow us to leverage the U.S. carbon advantage and hold accountable importers that use a lot more sort of carbon intensive methods to produce the very same kinds of goods that we do here at home in a more efficient way. And so these policies are beginning to proliferate on a unilateral and bilateral basis. We're also seeing interest in forums like the G7 to consider working more closely with our international partners to turn climate policy into a sort of a a new way to focus on what trade cooperation can look like so that we can work together with our most climate ambitious partners to engage in more international trade, more robust trade and climate solutions, while introducing the system of accountability for the highest emitters globally.
And I would just add, Stratton, what all of those policies have in common at the simplest level is an adjustment, or you could think of it as a fee at the border of countries, which is charged based on the carbon intensity of the goods or the carbon it took to make the goods coming into that country.
Got it. So I understand the concept, not just about, rewarding people, domestically or in countries that have made investments in lowering carbon intensity and increasing efficiency, but also the incentive it creates for other countries to sort of up their game on those same issues. But I'm curious, how do you guys respond to, inflation's been the hottest topic in the last 2 years. Obviously, we have spent many years since the Trump administration debating the validity of tariffs. So how do you guys respond to concerns that things like, a border carbon adjustment or fees, are a form of protectionism or raise, consumer prices or will exacerbate inflation?
Great questions. So it's interesting. A lot of the focus in this policy space is on the outcomes of the policy, right? So if you hear policymakers talk about this, particularly those that are supportive of these approaches, they'll note the carbon efficiency advantage of the United States versus, say, China. And they'll further correctly argue that with the right policy incentives in place, U.S. manufacturing, the U.S. economy is going to win, and higher emitting, less efficient countries like China are going to lose. Now, those are the likely outcomes of the policy, but that is not the objective of the policy or the policies as they're being implemented. The objective of the policies is to lower global emissions and to do so in the most economically efficient way possible, which is to create a system of competition in which all global players are competing based on the amount of carbon emissions it took to make the same goods. And so it's actually a system that encourages more seamless international trade. It's an approach that begs for greater global cooperation. It's no coincidence that when President Macron came to Washington last year with some concerns around some of the sourcing requirements in the Inflation Reduction Act, that soon after there was a lot of attention paid to the cooperation that was taking place simultaneously between the United States and the EU around this steel and aluminum carbon intensity arrangement. So again, the outcomes of these policies stand to benefit the U.S. economy, the U.S. worker, and U.S. businesses, but the structure and the formation and the implementation of them is actually very conducive with a free market, with unencumbered international trade, and an opportunity for everyone globally to participate. I'll just say one more word. We've talked about climate ambitious countries and those that are less ambitious. Instead of trying to get everybody on the same page, 190 countries to agree to the same global agreement, which we should continue pursuing, by the way. Under this approach, what we're doing is we're taking the biggest consumer countries in the world, the biggest, most influential economies, the United States, the EU, and others. They're forming together to form this system. And for those who are perhaps less inclined, those countries that are less inclined to step forward and make big cuts to their domestic emissions, they're faced with a choice, which is either improve your environmental performance or lose market share in the largest consumer economies in the world. And that, in part, is what's so compelling about this approach.
Okay, great. Let's take a quick break. And when we come back, let's touch again on some of the international negotiations and what we expect to see ahead. I'm Stratton Kirton, and you're listening to What's at Stake.
Every 2 weeks, HPS measures U.S. adults' feelings and expectations toward the economy. The Civic Science Economic Sentiment Index, powered by HPS, accurately measures movements in overall national economic sentiment and provides a more sophisticated alternative to existing economic sentiment indices. To learn more, contact us at hamiltonplacestrategies.com.
Welcome back to What's at Stake. I'm Stratton Kirton, partner at Penta, and I'm joined here with Greg and Catrina from the Climate Leadership Council. Now, Greg, Catrina, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I feel like, one of the things that we've touched on a little bit and sort of seems like, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is the role of China in the global economy and in global emissions. I think it was just, earlier this month that we saw the U.S. House vote on a special committee on China that by current political standards was a landslide of bipartisanship. So I'm curious, how do you see the role of China in the U.S. in these sort of policy negotiations? And what is the role, or what is the path forward? Is it cooperation? Is it conflict? Is it leveraging our technology to pull them along? What do you think is going to happen?
You cannot solve climate change without engaging China. They're the largest emitting country in the world. Their emissions are likely continuing to grow. And further, they are investing around the world in higher carbon infrastructure in the developing world. So we won't solve climate change without engaging China. To date, there's been one primary approach internationally, which is to engage them through the UN process at the COP. And that's seen, I would say, generously mixed results. So we've seen them step forward with commitments, although they've fallen short on verifiability. And when tensions between the U.S. and China get worse, we've seen them walk away from climate altogether. And so we would suggest that those engagements should continue, but we can't rely solely on that approach. We need to find an economic reason for China to really step up and be a meaningful contributor to solutions. And we believe leveraging trade is probably the most effective way to do that. So you mentioned and we've talked before, Stratton, about the Republican Select Committee on China. We know members on both sides of the aisle are quite focused on China beyond just climate change. But as those members of Congress are looking for a way to check China, to ensure that they are a fair actor in the global marketplace, and to ensure that they're doing their part to improve the global climate. This approach is particularly compelling because it allows us as a country to leverage what we're already doing very well, which is manufacturing while emitting fewer carbon emissions than China. And by establishing a system, particularly through partnership with like-minded countries like the EU, the EU and other like-minded countries, we can use more of a stick approach, if you will, to bring China to a more productive role in addressing global climate change.
Not to spend too much time on the data, but augmenting how we work with China on climate with, as Greg says, a stick approach shows a lot of promise. China's our largest trading partner. When we studied the sort of global carbon flows in that carbon loophole report, we identified that of the 20 largest global climate flows, 10 originate in China. It's a huge source of emissions. It's a country that is, its bread and butter is engaging in international trade, in owning these international supply lines. If we can introduce a system of climate accountability, then we create an incentive for the Chinese economy to start improving its carbon efficiency over time in order to keep global market share. We as major consumers have a tremendous amount of power in this relationship that we're not leveraging today. And the Chinese economy is 3 times more carbon intensive than the U.S. economy, which means we would benefit from this kind of competition tremendously, economically and through the global climate.
Now, I'm curious because one of the benefits, I think before we took a break, Greg, you said is these are policies we don't have to wait for 191 countries to come together and all agree. But I'm curious, there are obviously other international forums where climate change is a big focus other than the COP negotiations. I think one of you mentioned the G7, but I'm curious, what have we heard at other forums like the G7, like the G20 on some of these issues?
Thanks, Stratton. So international cooperation necessary necessary to driving down global emissions at the scale and speed required by the climate challenge. We know that global agreements are important to holding everybody accountable, promoting collaboration, addressing some challenges sort of uniquely facing developing countries and emerging markets. But we also know that these international climate dialogues are not on their own sufficient to the challenge. And it's for good reason. There's a lot to cover in these international climate dialogues. Emissions reduction is just one part of what they focus on. So, for example, the most recent COP over in Egypt was really focused on addressing adaptation concerns and damages from climate change that has occurred so far, right? So not narrowly focused on mitigation. And the more climate ambitious countries, I think you're seeing the result of productive impatience with what the COP process, these international climate dialogues, can deliver. And so now there are new conversations bubbling up on how to use additional forums to help us mobilize greater climate ambition and address emissions reduction. So one of those is the G7. It's moving from the German presidency last year to a Japanese presidency this year. And the Germans spent their presidency advancing this concept of an inclusive climate club. So introducing these concepts of climate accountability in the trading system, but also making sure that this sort of club approach ensures that we're working with international partners, all of the G7 members, yes, but also emerging markets that we might want to trade more with, emerging markets that we might want to facilitate their development. So an inclusive climate club. And as the Japanese take the presidency of the G7, we'll see how this idea evolves. But we're seeing a lot of focus in this international forum on finding new ways to develop international partnerships that allow us to mobilize climate solutions through the trade system, benefit clean firms in these G7 economies, and also bring emerging markets along with us to decarbonize, to promote greater international trade, to get everybody on a maybe like a new page of cooperation where we're using trade and climate together instead of seeing them as sort of like antagonizing forces.
So we're sitting here, it's January at the beginning of 2023. What are you guys thinking of over the next 2 years or longer as the key moments, either domestically or internationally, that you're going to focus on and that other people who are interested in this space should pay attention to?
I'll start. We'll obviously watch with great interest the ongoing development of the EU's CBAM proposal. It's the first and only major climate and trade policy being publicly implemented anywhere in the world. But closer to home, we know there's a big and growing interest around a similar approach in the United States. And so that's something that we'll be watching very closely on both sides of the Capitol. And then this ongoing negotiation the Biden administration is engaged on with the EU to implement the first ever trade deal to incorporate carbon intensity for steel and aluminum, which we think holds promise to be expanded to include other countries and perhaps other commodities. So I think the next 2 years is going to see an acceleration in the focus among policymakers in the U.S. and globally around these policy proposals. And that's a good thing. A lot of important details to be worked through. But at the end of the day, we're not going to solve climate change without addressing international trade and the emissions that are embodied in goods traded internationally.
Catrina, what about you?
I'll just add to Greg's list. I remarked earlier about the G7 moving to the Japanese presidency, and so we'll see how they shape this idea of an inclusive climate club. We should also watch other countries and see whether they'll put forward their own policies, like the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, like these policy concepts that are being debated, particularly in the Senate right now. I've got my eye on a couple of countries, including Canada and the UK. And we'll see how those policy conversations evolve in consultation. But this is a new sort of frontier in the climate discussion, but policy change is happening so quickly. And so we're going to keep our eye on the international community to see how the landscape shifts.
Okay, very quickly, sort of a lightning round. Is there anything we missed in our discussion that you think our listeners should know about? We'll go Catrina and then Greg.
I was hoping Greg would talk about polling.
Greg, do you want to tell our listeners about polling?
Sure. So at the end of the day, doesn't matter how sound and effective policies are if they don't have the political support to be placed in law by democratic societies, then we're not going to get very far. And yet another encouraging element of this climate and trade intersection is that it's very politically popular with voters. We're talking about a climate approach that leverages the strength of the U.S. economy, that would benefit more efficient U.S. manufacturers and by extension, drive economic development, jobs, and opportunity for Americans. You won't be surprised with that framing to learn that it polls very well on both sides of the aisle. We've polled Democrats, we've polled conservative Republicans, we've polled young voters, old voters, Trump voters, and across the board, whether you believe in climate change or not, whether it's a top priority or very low on your list, if you approach this issue, if you present this issue as a way to lower global emissions, boost U.S. businesses and workers, and hold accountable those in the global economy who aren't doing their part, you find broad support.
This has been a great conversation. Greg, Catrina, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. For our listeners, to hear more episodes of What's at Stake, subscribe to our channel, the Penta Podcast channel, wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on Twitter at Penta GRP or on our website, which is pentagroup.co. I'm Stratton Kirton. Thank you for listening to What's at Stake.
Thank you for listening to What's at Stake, a podcast produced by Penta. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at PentaGRP and follow us on the web at penta.co.